All right, so last time we were talking about chapter 4 was Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, and he was talking about social evolution, right? And he says that successful societies outcompete societies that are unsuccessful, and that over time we get a movement towards the successful society. So we went from feudalism to mercantilism to market capitalism in the West, and the other societies are developing mechanisms to make themselves more market capitalist. In the last few years, we maybe seen some movement away from that, but nonetheless, what he says is this is a spontaneous order, right? It is spontaneous in the sense that nobody is in charge, but it's orderly. Like we made the point that 9 million people woke up in New York City today, and there was exactly the right amount of Starbucks coffee again. There was exactly the right amount of peanuts and everything else. Okay? And why did that happen? It happened because the system of prices makes it so that we move towards equilibrium. Right? So it's spontaneous, but it is orderly. And the innovations, actually, this is fine. Here it is. Put this on. And innovations occur then and in a market-based society, and that moves all of society forward. So chapter 5 now is a key factor of a free society, and chapter 5 is about responsibility. Right? Chapter 5 is about responsibility. And what he's saying is that, this is a quote, he says, "A free society will not function or maintain itself unless its members regard it as right that each individual occupy the position that results from his action and accept it as due to his own action." Okay? So let's try that again. A free society will not function or maintain itself unless its members regard it as right that each individual occupy the position that results from his action and accept it as due to his own action. Okay? So, your position in the world, right, is due to your own action. We think that's the way that we ought to organize ourselves, and of course that's how market systems work. But he says a free society can't maintain itself unless you guys regard it as right that you individual occupy that position and that you accept that it's due to your action, right? It's due to your own action and that you accept this. Right? You think this is the proper way to do it. What he's really saying is that a market society or any society based on voluntary cooperation, right? That's what Mises and we've been talking about is voluntary cooperation, right? This is a system of voluntary exchange, right? And how we occupy, how did pencils get here, right? So it's all voluntary. We're cooperating with one another. Then he says it can't work unless you think that the outcome is fair, right? It can't work unless you think the outcome is fair. Right? So the wealthy are wealthy in a market system. Why? The wealthy are wealthy because they produce things that other people want, right? And they please lots and lots of people. And people who are poor, how did we talk about that in the beginning of the class? They have a low value of marginal product, right? They don't add a lot of value. And when Mises was saying that you can't increase the wealth of the poor by having minimum wage, the only way you can increase the standard of living of the poor is to make them more productive. And what he's saying here is that yeah, what did we say? You know, I asked the question early on. I said, how many of you have ever used a Microsoft product, right? And you all raised your hand. And then I said, well, how many of you have ever, other than paid tuition, how many of you have ever paid to listen to me speak, right? Nobody raised their hand. And I said, that's why Bill Gates is rich and I'm not, right? So it is a matter of, in a market-based society, where people are free to act according to their own plan. That's what we said liberty is about, right? What is freedom or liberty? What's going on here? You need to act according to your own plan. That is a system whereby how did you get wealthy? By pleasing other people. Yeah, I have a high value of marginal product in our, when we were talking about demand and supply curves and that kind of thing at the beginning of the class. Okay, and so basically that this system can't work if you guys don't think it's fair, right? You'll try to overthrow the system, or you will try to intervene in the system, right? Then he says, a free society can only offer choices; it can't guarantee outcomes. A free society can only offer choices. It can't guarantee outcome. And what is the result of that? Think about what did Bastiat say, right? Bastiat said almost the same thing, didn't he? Bastiat said the law cannot do more than provide you with the free and inoffensive use of your faculties to make yourself better off, right? To improve your situation. So what Bastiat is saying is very consistent with what Hayek is talking about here. And he's saying that if we witness a decline in the belief of individual responsibility, then we're going to get a decline in freedom, right? If we have a decline in the belief in individual responsibility, what are you going to get? You're going to decline in freedom. And he says that a fear of responsibility entails a fear of freedom, right? You're afraid to be free, right? That is, a fear of responsibility entails a fear of freedom. You don't want to take on that uncertainty that, well, maybe you're going to be the person that doesn't have a very high value of marginal product. Maybe you're going to be the person that is in the bottom 10% of the income distribution. And you're going to say, hey, I don't want to be responsible for my actions. I don't want my reward to depend on how well I do to please other people. What does that mean? It means that you are afraid to be free, right? If you are afraid of responsibility, then you're afraid to be free to act according to your own plan. And then he says, why do we want people to be responsible, right? Why would we want people to be responsible? And if you sort of think about it, it's because they'll behave more efficiently. Right? They'll behave more efficiently. That is, they'll be more careful about putting themselves in situations where bad things could happen, right? Or they will, if you're responsible for your actions, then you're going to put yourself in places where good things could happen. If you've ever rented a car, some people might have rented a car, but if you rent a car from Enterprise or something and the oil needs to be changed in another 3,000 miles and you're out on a 5,000 mile trip, you don't stop partway on the trip and get the oil changed, right? Because if something happens, you're not responsible. What are you going to do? You're going to call Enterprise, and they're going to come out and give you a new car if something goes wrong, right? So when if you take my law and economics class, we spend a good deal of time looking at whether you should be responsible for your actions, because we want you to take proper precaution. We want to set up the rules of the game. So are you liable for causing an accident, right? If you're not responsible, then you're going to behave differently, right? If the other person's going to if you have an accident and the other person's going to be totally responsible and have to compensate you, then you're not going to take proper precaution, right? That's what we call in law and economics, it's called strict liability. That is, if the person crashes into you, then you're going to not worry about whether you were going faster than the speed limit. You won't be worried about whether you were paying attention or not, and maybe they were coming at you and you could have swerved away or something like that, okay? So, and if there's no liability, then what will happen is, if there's no liability on the person that caused the accident, then they're not going to undertake proper precaution, right? They're not going to slow down, they're not going to put anti-lock brakes on their car and that kind of thing, right? So when we do in law and economics is we look at people's incentives and we look at this very thing. That is, what will happen if you're responsible for your actions and what will happen if you're not. And what will happen is, if you are not responsible, we go out and talk about it in some detail in law and economics, but if you're not responsible, then you're not going to behave efficiently. And so what the purpose here of why we want to have people responsible for their actions is because we want people to behave in a responsible fashion. We want people to behave in an efficient manner. Right? And if you are going to be rewarded for an innovation, right? What did we talk about profit about? When we were talking about profit, what does it do? We said in the midterm, it acts as an incentive to take on the risk of innovation. If you aren't rewarded for that, if you're not held responsible when a good thing happens, or if you're not responsible if something bad happens, then you're going to behave in a way that isn't nearly as efficient. And this is what in the insurance industry is called moral hazard. In insurance, we know about this. And again, we talk about this in law and economics. But anybody know what moral hazard is? Okay. So moral hazard is when you're insured against something, you take on more risk. If you're insured against something, you'll take on more risk, right? So in law and economics, we basically show that you won't take on the efficient amount of risk, where the marginal benefit of reducing the chance of an accident is equal to the marginal cost of undertaking whatever you need to do to reduce that risk, okay? So if I have an automobile insurance, we know that if you're going to be insured against damages to your vehicle or damage to you go to the hospital or whatever, then what's going to happen is you're not going to behave in as safe a fashion. So what do? If you've ever seen the ads for State Farm, right, you have the safe driver discount, right? What's the safe driver discount about? It's that if you take more precaution about driving and you never get a ticket, you never get an accident, etc., then what's going to happen? Our premiums will be lower. Or maybe we'll give you a discount if you have anti-lock brakes in your car, right? Or we might make it so that if you have fire insurance, we might make it so that if you have smoke alarms, you get a lower a lower premium, or we have deductibles. There's all sorts of ways that insurance companies try to deal with this moral hazard idea. But the big picture that Hayek's talking about is that if you guys aren't responsible for your actions, if you're going to get rewarded whether you do this thing efficiently or not, then what's going to happen? You're going to behave differently. You're going to behave in a way that's not as efficient. Yes?
Could that idea be taken to the point where that's why people on Social Security are more likely to buy lottery tickets? Because it's sort of the same idea where they're getting money for not doing as much, so they're willing to incur more risk to earn more?
Well, the question was, is that if people are on Social Security, are they more likely to buy lottery tickets? And the answer is no. That's sort of the short answer. But that has to do with what's called diminishing margin utility of income. And if you may be willing to, some people may have increasing margin utility of income, and some people may have diminishing margin utility of income. So what we're talking about, if the marginal benefit of the next dollar is less than the one that was there before, then you'll behave in a different fashion than if the added value to you of the next dollar is much higher. So if you look at lottery tickets are structured in a way to make it so that you win a lot with low probability, and with the idea that, oh my gosh, if I lose this dollar, then that's not going to affect me too much. But if I get that $1 million or whatever, my benefits are going to go way up. So it doesn't really have to do with moral hazard. It has to do with the added utility. People, when they take gambles, has to do with the margin utility of income, which, again, we talk about in my law and economics class. But yeah, did you have a thought?
On the issue of moral hazard, how would this apply to corporations? Say, I know there's a lot of frustration around the big tech censorship right now. It's a big hot topic with Twitter just basically deleting the New York Post's ability to post articles after they put something up that was politically disadvantageous to the Joe Biden campaign, and it went for like 5 days. I didn't check it over the weekend, but I have a feeling that their account hasn't been reinstated yet. That's part of a long history of pretty anti-free speech actions. I know they're not a government agency, but they seem to feel that they can't be sued for censorship. The Tulsi Gabbard campaign tried to go after Google for suspending their advertisement right after a debate. There's a long train of things like this. Do they have some sort of do you see this as the government's fault for creating a carve out for them, or what?
Well, basically the question is that Twitter or whatever can delete people's accounts if they go in a way that the people at Twitter don't want them to do. That doesn't have anything. Moral hazard is just that if you're insured against an accident, then you will undertake more risk. You'll drive faster or whatever. So all that's going on is that what we're talking about here is that if the government is responsible if things go wrong, then what's going to happen? Then you're going to behave in a way that is not efficient. You're going to undertake more risk than would be optimal. All right. Then he says that basically people have to again believe that the results from this system are fair. Right? You have to believe that the system is fair. If you don't believe it's fair, then you'll try to overthrow the system, right? This system of individual liberty won't be there. And he says that again. He says that he says, summarizing this thing, he says the expectation that people will be held responsible for their action will, on the whole, influence men in a desirable fashion. Now. Second point is that if you're not responsible for your action, those who are will coerce you, right? If you're not responsible for your action, those who are will coerce you. Right? If you are not let's say you're learning to drive and you're 16, and if there's a car accident, your parents have to pay for it, then they're not going to let you take your car or take the car and just go and do whatever you want with it. As an example, when my daughter was learning to drive, when she was 16, we wouldn't let her listen to the radio in the car, right? Because we didn't want her to be distracted. Now, she wanted to listen to the radio, but we weren't letting her act according to her own plan. She was acting according to our plan. Now, if she had her own car and she had her own car insurance, etc., then that would be different, right? And so maybe children or people who are not capable of being mentally competent in a certain situation, maybe they wouldn't be responsible for their actions. But if they are, the people who are responsible are going to say, here's how it works, right? And in particular, if you think about what happens if government is responsible, then what's going to happen? You're going to get a coercive government. And remember that, what's the purpose of government, right? We said the purpose of government is to minimize coercion, right? The purpose of government is to minimize coercion. And so if the government is responsible for what happens to you, then if the government's responsible for, let's say, if there's a flood and it's going to replace your house, the government's going to say, you can't build in this floodplain, okay? Or the government's going to say, you have to have certain type of you have to have a certain type of product liability. The government's going to require you to do things if they're going to end up being responsible in some sense for whatever you do. So no matter who it is, that is, if you think the government is responsible for your health insurance, right? Then what's going to happen? The government's going to tell you, okay, here's the type of health insurance you have to have. Here's what you have to do. If you are going to go to the doctor, you have to fill out this form, and you can go to the doctor if this happens or not, or that happens or whatever. So the government's going to tell you what to do. So again, if you're listening to people that are running for office, if they're saying you're not responsible for your actions, we the government are, then what's going to happen? The government's not going to minimize the total amount of coercion. The government's going to be increasing the amount of coercion. And notice that what's the logic behind all of this is that what is the proper role of government, right? And notice that each of the three authors that we've read now, they all get to the same spot. That is, the role of government is limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Okay, but they all get there from different starting points. Mises starts out with, I want to create wealth for the masses. Capitalism is the only way to do that. Capitalism requires a political philosophy, and it's not anarchistic. But one of the foundations of liberalism is limited government, right? That markets can't work efficiently unless you have limited government. If you look at Bastiat, what did he say? He said, we all have a natural right to self-defense, right? That's what he starts out with. We all have a natural right to self-defense, and what is the government's role then? A just government is there to protect us, right? It is to protect we have this natural right to self-defense. And so what's government to do? We form a government in order to protect ourselves. And a just government, he says, fulfills that purpose. So it's limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. What does Hayek come about, right? Hayek's coming about, we said that information's decentralized, right? When he was talking about making the best use of knowledge in his paper that's in the folder there. Because information is decentralized, the best way to make efficient use of that information that's decentralized is you guys act according to your own plan. And what is the role of government then? The role of government is to maximize that amount of freedom or minimize the total amount of coercion. And so if the government's going to minimize total coercion, you're going to have to be responsible for your actions, right? So again, when you look at the old midterms, you'll notice that I will ask you to go through that logic for Hayek and Bastiat, perhaps in the midterm, but on the final, you'll notice I always have a question asking you to give me the logic and what does each of the authors agree, or what does each of the authors think is the proper role of government, and what's the logic by which they got there. All right, so make sure that you've got that in your head there. Then he says that responsibility has to not just be a legal concept, but it has to be a moral concept, right? That is, responsibility is a legal concept, but it also has to be a moral concept, right? We can't, when we, in the law and economics class, we go and we talk about different kinds of responsibilities that you might have for an accident, strict liability or no liability, or who's responsible, when there's a car crash, who's responsible, and how do we want to set the law up, etc. But Hayek's saying it goes beyond just, here's what the law says, this is a legal concept about responsibility, but it has to be a moral sense in that you have to believe that this system is moral, right? What he was just talking about. You have to believe that your position in life is due to your action, and that's the way it ought to be, right? So you have to believe that this is moral, otherwise, what will happen? You'll overthrow the system. Now, you might not do it in one fell swoop, but over time, what you'll end up with? More and more government intervention, more and more government coercion, and a further and further limitation on what you can do in terms of acting according to your own plan. Then he says, this is a quote, he says, "A free society depends more than any other that people be guided by a sense of responsibility for their action." Okay? Why is a free society depends more than any other that people be responsible? And sort of think about it. If it's not a free society, then I don't need you to be responsible, right? If I'm going to tell you what to do, then you're not going to be responsible for your actions. You're just going to do whatever I tell you to do. So if you want to have a free society where people can act according to their own plan, then you got to have people being responsible. But if you have a coercive society, it doesn't make sense for you to be responsible for your actions, right? So the government's telling you what to do. And so it doesn't make sense that in a coercive society that you guys are responsible for your actions, right? So that's his point here, is that you have to be guided by this sense of responsibility in a free society. And he says that why do we allow people freedom? We allow people freedom because we assume that they're knowledgeable and responsible, right? We let people be free because we assume they're knowledgeable and responsible, right? That is, again, we assume that what? That information is decentralized, and you're the one that knows what you think is best for you, and you're the only one that can figure that out. Then he goes on and he talks about how a freedom to pursue one's own actions is important for altruism as well, right? That is, individual liberty is important for altruism, right? Notice this is basically what Bastiat was saying, right? Remember that Bastiat said that if you have a ability to act according to your own plan, right? And he's talking about how can I be altruistic if what I'm doing is forced to join the society. Remember, what he says is that voluntary associations are good, but involuntary associations are not just, right? And you know, we talked about where that if you're not going to have the government redistributing income, right, taking from some people and giving to others, which would be a violation of the purpose of government for Bastiat. If you're not going to have that, then what do you need to do? You need to have societies or people, form a nonprofit organization and capture donations and give them out to people, provide free lunches to people who lost their jobs because of COVID or whatever, right? So voluntary associations are what is necessary in order to have a just government or a system of just government, and that we talked about Herbert Spencer, right? And we said that Herbert Spencer said the problem with the poor laws in Great Britain, and again he was writing about the same time as Bastiat, he said the problem with the poor laws in Great Britain is not that the poor will take advantage of them, but rather the rich will think they don't have to take care of the poor. Okay? So the point that Hayek is making is very much like Bastiat saying that it is the role of individuals to take care of the poor. It is the role of individuals to give of their own in order to make the poor better off. And that if you have the government do that, then that's not being altruistic. In fact, what Hayek says is that he says moral esteem is meaningless without freedom. Moral esteem is meaningless without freedom. So, again, if you sometimes you'll see there's a highway up in the Upper Peninsula that's named after a Speaker of the House that was a Speaker of the House for a long time, and this memorial is there as if what he was doing was altruistic, but he wasn't being altruistic. What he was doing was he was getting your tax dollars, or not yours because you weren't alive, but other people's tax dollars and directing them towards the different roads and infrastructure in the Upper Peninsula. Okay, so it wasn't a matter, and what he says is that if you have a government program that takes from some people and gives to others, then nobody's being altruistic in that game. So think about if we're thinking about how Social Security works, right? We've talked about this when we were talking about Bastiat, talking about this is legalized plunder, right? But you guys don't recognize it. But think about it this way. No one that's receiving Social Security is involved in altruism at all, and nobody that is giving out Social Security is being altruistic. Because you aren't being altruistic, because to be altruistic you have to be able to not act, right? That is, altruism requires you be able to not act, right? That you could say, hey, I'm not going to do that. Social Security doesn't work that way, right? You have to give up your tax dollars. Now, the people that are giving the money out aren't being altruistic. They're giving your money away. It's not their money that they're giving away, okay? And the people who are receiving Social Security, they're not thinking that it's altruistic. Nobody that gets Social Security is saying, oh my gosh, this is so great that the House of Representatives and the Senate are keeping Social Security, and the President is signing these bills to increase the amount of Social Security that goes on, and that was so nice of them to do that. I'm very grateful, right? No, you're going, hey, I've been paying money into Social Security, I should get it, right? Now, we've already talked about why that's not how it really works, but that's how people view it. No one is seeing it as being altruistic. So when the government is being coercive, that it is doing something beyond protecting life, liberty, and property, it's not maximizing the amount of your ability to act according to your own plan, right? That's what government's trying to do. So it's to act, to increase your ability to act according to your own plan because you are knowledgeable and you will behave differently if you can't have your ability to act according to your own plan unless you're responsible for your actions, and altruism requires that you be responsible for your actions. If somebody's just coercing you, then it's not going to be an altruistic situation. So then he points out, he says, in a market society, success depends not on your native talent, but how well you use your ability. Right? In a market, success depends not on pure talent or ability, but how well you use it. That means if you were born with a lot of ability, or you were in a situation where we talked about this, had more options than someone else does, that's not what breeds success. LeBron James doesn't make the enormous amount of money that he does just because he's got a lot of native ability, right? He does it because he's won world championships with 3 different franchises. Okay? He could be enormously talented, but if he doesn't accomplish anything with that talent, then in a market system, he's just not going to be rewarded. You guys are probably too young to remember, but there was a guy named Pete Rose that was a Major League Baseball player that was one of the best hitters in baseball of all time. It turns out he would have been in the Hall of Fame, except for there was a thing about whether he gambled on a game or whatever, so he ended up not being in the Hall of Fame. But nonetheless, he certainly performed well enough to be in the Hall of Fame. And his talent was way less than other players. Everybody knew that the reason Pete Rose got all these hits is because he studied the pitchers, he practiced an enormous amount, he used his abilities, but he accomplished things with them. And so in a market system, you're not rewarded just because you have some sort of native ability. In a market system, you're rewarded based on how well you produce for other people, right? That's what we've talked about over and over again. System of voluntary exchange. I get wealthy if I can go out and please other people. And again, it would be interesting to think of what the alternative to that would be. If somehow they just figure out, oh, this person's got more talent, and so we're going to reward them, right? That would be an odd situation. So the market system, again, we want you to act according to your own plan. We want you to make the most efficient use of your knowledge, and we want you to make the most efficient use of your talent and your ability. And by you being rewarded by the system of individual responsibility, by you being rewarded for the successes, and you lose when you have failures, again, you're going to behave in a more efficient fashion. Then he points out, he says, responsibility can extend only to the actions that are in the realm of your foresight. Right? It can only extend, responsibility can only extend to actions that are in the realm of your foresight. And that is simply logic, right? Because why do I want you to act according to your own plan, right? Why do I want you to be able to have the broadest range of choices? It's because you have the best knowledge about what you are doing, right? And I want you to be responsible in order that you will take an efficient amount of action or efficient amount of precaution. For example, in law and economics, we talk about that we want you to take the efficient amount of precaution when you're driving. Whether you're a potential victim or potential injurer, we would like you to take enough precaution that the added benefit of your additional precaution is equal to the added cost of your efficient of the amount of precaution that you're taking. But it doesn't make sense to say, oh, I want you to be held responsible for things that you don't even know could possibly happen. So let's say an asteroid landed in Hillsdale and it wiped out like 500 houses in Hillsdale. There is nothing that was in the realm of your foresight that could say, oh, I shouldn't have built the house in Hillsdale because this asteroid came along, right? I want you to behave in a certain way that makes the most efficient use of your resources, so it doesn't make sense to say you're going to be responsible for things that you couldn't have foreseen, right? That just doesn't make logical sense. So that to be responsible for your actions, it makes it so that we want to have you behave in a certain fashion, so you can't be responsible for things that are purely accidental, right? Now, in law and economics, if there's something that's accidental, but you could have undertaken an activity to reduce the probability of that happening, right? Then the possibility of an accident is within the realm of your foresight. And so we want you to, not drive at 90 miles an hour. We want you to, follow the speed limit or whatever. But if you sort of think through why we want you to be responsible for actions, it doesn't make sense to say, this was totally unforeseen, and so we're going to make you responsible for your actions anyway. In fact, in law and economics, we have, in contract law, there's a discussion about what happens if there was a totally unforeseen event. Do you enforce the contract or whatever? Yeah.
So how does this point factor into the government's role in people's lives? That if something happens that's outside of the realm of their foresight, does that mean that it's the government's job to step in and help them? Or what does this point mean
well,
for the Constitution of Liberty?
Yeah. Does this affect what the government should be able to do? And the idea is not necessarily. All we're saying here is it doesn't make sense for the law or other people to hold you responsible for something that was totally unforeseen. Because why do I want you to be responsible? I want you to be responsible so you use your individual talents and your individual knowledge in the most efficient fashion. So that means you can only be responsible for something that you might know about. I can't be responsible. And in fact, another point that he makes here is you can't be held responsible for the actions of others. Now, this is not quite true. That is, you could be held responsible for their actions of your children. Okay? If there's something that we say, okay, those people aren't going to be able to be properly responsible for their actions, okay, then you might be held responsible for that. But in general, if we're talking about individuals that are knowledgeable, right? If they're knowledgeable, reasonable individuals, then it doesn't make sense for somebody else to be responsible for what they're doing. It only makes sense for you to be responsible for the actions of yourself. Now, notice that this will affect the amount of conflict in the world in the following sense. So there was, you're maybe too young to remember this, but there was a major conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and a million of them got killed, and so it was a warfare about one group of people, the Hutus, and another group called the Tutsis. And what was going on? If a Hutu did something to one of the Tutsis, then you could attack another Hutu for doing that. So what you might get is tribal warfare or clan warfare, or you might say, well, yeah, the Germans did this, and so I'm going to attack all Germans because they're a German. Or if you, I don't know, you might have seen some documentaries about how people that were Japanese are treated in the United States in World War II. Okay, but you can't, if you can blame other people for the actions of people that are like them for the group, then what you're likely to get is more action, more civil unrest. You might get more civil war and those sort of things. We can't attack people that are from the South because this Southerner did something to us, and we're now going to attack all the Southerners because of what this one individual did. And so conflicts that last a very long time, right? Let's take the war in Afghanistan. There's a tendency for those sorts of things to make it so that you can be held responsible for the actions of people that are around you or are part of your group, and so you get civil unrest, you get group warfare, etc. All right. That pretty much covers chapter 5. So what we're going to do for Friday is we will look at chapter 6. Chapter 6 is going to be one of those chapters where I summarize what it is, okay, like we did with 2, 3, and 4. Chapter 7 is the chapter on democracy. And we're going to spend a good deal of time on chapter 7 because democracy, of course, is one of the foundations of liberalism. And so for Friday, you might certainly have read chapter 6, but maybe work your way partly through chapter 7 because that's what we're going to talk about on Friday.